and the doors are shut and the music goes down, and welcome back to the Future Forum. So it is my pleasure to introduce the next session. It's called The Rising Tide, and we're going to focus on the impact of climate change and how that's going to impact communities all across the region. And these experts are going to offer their expert opinion on potential solutions on what we can do as citizens to do our part to prepare and help to prevent disaster as much as possible. Now, before I invite them to come up on stage, I also want to say thank you to everyone who has come here and supported HubWeek and participated in HubWeek. I hope that you have thoroughly enjoyed it. I have to get on a plane to go to another side of the world to do another conference, and I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed being with you all today. And thank you so much for your participation. HubWeek will be at the same week next year, the Columbus Day week, and we hope to see you there. I am going to pass the mic and the stage over to my friend and colleague, Cecilia Nicolini, who is just a fantastic talent. And she is just finished her fellowship at Harvard at the Kennedy School. And I leave you in her competent hands. Cecilia.
The clicker. Thank you very much, Kathleen, and safe travels to Dubai. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. My name is Cecilia Nicolini. I'm a research fellow at Harvard, and I'm also the director of the Spanish edition of MIT Technology Review. And I'm very honored to be moderating this session today about the impact that climate change is having in our countries, in our regions, and in our lives. And climate change is one of the most serious challenges we are facing as a society. And to talk about this, I would like to welcome 4 formidable speakers that are specifically working on how the city of Boston is getting ready to face this threat. So please help me to welcome the 4th speaker for today. We have Maya Mansfield. She is program manager for Climate Ready Boston at the City of Boston. John Reilly, senior lecturer and co-director of the Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Climate Change at MIT. Katie Theoharides, beautiful Greek last name, Assistant Secretary of Climate Change at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And Kishore Varanasi, Principal Director of Urban Design at CBT. So thank you very much for being here today, this afternoon. I will start with some questions, but I will try to keep at least 10 minutes to open the question for the audience, because I think it's a very interesting topic to talk about this. And the first question is related to the devastating consequences that the hurricane had in Puerto Rico, in Houston, in Florida. And it makes us think that how important it is to work on getting ready for climate change. So can you talk us a little bit about how our communities are going to face this risk, and how we can proactively start working together on this? If you want to start.
Hi, my name is Maya Mansfield. I am the Climate Ready Boston Program Manager in the City of Boston Environment Department, right behind us in City Hall. Climate Ready Boston is the city's initiative for how we're understanding the climate change impacts that Boston will be facing from now through the end of the century, and how we're starting to change how we plan and develop the city based on that data. So in Boston, the main threats that we're looking at are sea level rise, increased precipitation, and extreme temperatures. The Climate Ready Boston plan was launched last December, and before that it started with a pretty rigorous scientific consensus building process with the top climate scientists from across the state and across New England who were convened and developed a report for the city that showed, how are all these impacts going to play out specifically for the Boston metro area, and what is the most up-to-date and reliable science that the city should be using for planning. So we started with that process. We learned from that sea level rise impacts in the city in the near term will be about 9 inches, and then later on in the century, at least 36 inches or 3 feet, and it could be much higher based on what carbon emissions scenario you're looking at globally. We also learned that rainfall events are going to increase by 20%, and that days above 90 degrees are going to go from about 11 each year, which we see now, to between 20 and 40 in the coming decades, and potentially up to 90 by late century. So a very different climate for this region than we're used to. And the city is now undergoing a process to look at how those impacts are going to affect the residents and the built environment and the natural environment of the city. And then immediately once the report was released, start looking at the neighborhoods that are going to be most impacted initially by sea level rise. So the waterfront neighborhoods like East Boston, Charlestown, South Boston, and Dorchester, and figure out the specific strategies that we're going to start putting in place now to reduce that risk. But climate change is obviously a huge challenge with many different complexities and many agencies and level of government, not to mention the role of the private sector and the greater Boston community. So the city is trying to be out front and take a leadership role in understanding what the impacts and what the possible solutions might be, but it's really something that takes a lot more than just the city government.
Great. Well, I have the great opportunity of working a lot with Maya in my role as Assistant Secretary of Climate Change for the state. And the position started about a year ago, but a new focus for the Baker-Polito administration on climate change and really on coordinating all of the efforts to date on climate change and expanding on them. And so I work both on the mitigation side of climate change to combat the direct causes of climate change, but also on adapting to climate change and making sure our communities are preparing for the impacts we're already feeling. I think we've been watching the hurricanes, watching the wildfires out in California. They're scary stories of what the future is going to look like. And even the weather we've been having this month of October, I think everyone would agree it's feeling very warm, very, very humid for October. So we're seeing these changes already. One of the things state government has done in response to climate change is last September, Governor Baker signed an executive order relative to climate change, focused both on continuing to make progress to reduce our carbon emissions, but also on directing state and local governments to begin preparing for the challenge of climate change. And so one of the things we're doing through that is we're working with our Mass Emergency Management Agency, who reports up through FEMA with the federal government, to create a first-in-the-nation combined climate change and hazard mitigation plan. It's looking at the climate change impacts, combining them with a focus on natural hazards that we've always planned for, and thinking about how those will change into the future. So that's been a big effort. I think one of the things that's been very important for us is that this work isn't just in our environmental agencies. I sit in the environmental side of things, but we're working on this across state government. So transportation, housing and economic development, administration and finance, all of our cabinet level secretariats are working through this effort. And another big piece of it, and then I'll shut up for a minute, is we have a new program very much inspired by the work Boston and a number of other cities are doing, who've sort of taken a leadership role on planning and preparing for climate change. And we wanted to see other cities and towns, we have 351 across Massachusetts, be able to start working on this challenge themselves. Tend to have a lot more limited funding than Boston for these types of efforts, or just access to grant programs. So we have it's called the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, and it helps cities and towns begin grassroots efforts to plan for climate change. We provide the science and data, grant funding so they can hire technical support to do the planning work, but it really needs to be based in a community desire to do that work. So communities lead the effort, and in this year, in our first round, we had 20% of Massachusetts cities and towns sign up for the program.
And thank you. And it's also interesting to have different perspectives. Like in this panel, we have the public sector, but as well the private sector and the university. So John, can you share with us?
Sure. Will you ask a bit about what Hurricane Harvey meant and what lessons we might take from that? I mean, there we did see the combination of both tropical storm, sea level rise, and heavy rain. So when we think about sea level rise or flooding, we often think right around the coast. But if you combine that with heavy rain, then you can get flooding inland. So you have those combined problems that make the problem much worse. We actually expect to see, with ocean warming, tropical storms hitting New England more frequently. There have been hurricanes that hit New England. They don't hit any place very frequently. They're a rare event. So we don't know, we can't predict when, but the likelihood of them hitting here and being stronger has increased. The heat is also an important issue. I run a program at MIT trying to understand and model the future. We're working at MIT to think about how MIT is vulnerable to climate change, focusing on the three same things. You mentioned the city of Boston, Mia. An interesting kind of perspective MIT has taken on this is to kind of think of the layers of your site. One, you have the actual geography you're on. Where is your geography? Are you exposed to, are you in a place that's exposed to climate? What does the underground services look like feeding into your buildings? What do utilities look like? What does the building look like? Is it the building itself, and then the population of the campus? Or you can put this on your family level. What's happening in the underground services, the utilities, the sewer to your system? Is that going to be affected by climate change? What about your generator, electricity, your telephone, your communications? What about the house itself, the roof? Can it resist wind? And then what about how do you prepare your family and stay in contact? I think we developed this MIT to kind of think about the campus. I think it's a really way that anyone can think about, are you prepared for this? And I guess I would urge that, I think what we learned from Texas, fortunately, I think our state is actually taking the problem a little bit more seriously and preparing, but ultimately you have to think about your role as a homeowner. Are you living someplace that's near the ocean that's at risk? You may have insurance, but what will happen is the insurance rates will go up. So do you want to continue to live there? We have these kind of perverse things that happen where FEMA comes in and reclassifies something as a flood zone, and everyone objects because the insurance rates go up. If you don't raise the insurance rates, that doesn't reduce the flood risk. It's still there. So we kind of hate to have the information given to us at times. So I think everyone really has to think about this yourself, because the city and state can't save you from these problems if you aren't thinking about it yourself.
So yeah, as everybody pointing out on the stage here, what's fascinating and complicated is that it is multidimensional. Previously, you could solve problems in individual silos, but climate change is a problem where you need to bring a whole host of disciplines to the table and solve it together, because the problems are environmental, sociological, and scientific, technological. I believe that we're still at a very early stage of really understanding a lot of this. But the good news is all of us are working at different scales. Nobody has given up. We're actually trying to learn and get better and better. What I do on a daily basis is I'm an urban designer and planner. I work on large projects around the globe. Most of the scale of projects that I work on, really, I work on a lot of waterfront cities. I work a lot with the water and how it impacts buildings, how it impacts planning of the cities. And of course, when you're thinking new on a blank slate, it's very easy to sort of solve for these problems. But if you think of a city like Boston, which is quite unique, by the way, compared to some of the other American cities, we have a very intimate relationship to the ocean than many other cities. Many other cities were invaded by infrastructure, so were we, but not as badly. So they still have a separation between their water and their built form. Boston is not like that, good or bad. We're right on the water. So we don't have a lot of place to play with in terms of working with the water and defending the water. So one needs to get really, really creative at multiple scales, not just at a large scale. I know that it's very easy to think that there is a regional solution that's out in the water somewhere, which I think there is, but you don't have to wait, or you shouldn't wait for that long-term solution to come in to do something today. And that's what we do on a daily basis. When we look at a building and a project, we're really trying to understand, okay, I'm a private developer who's trying to build this building. What is my horizon? What are my risks? What can I do today? And what is my ability to adapt this building, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, because science is evolving and environment is evolving. Translating that to you, all of us in general as individuals, I think we need to develop a much better relationship with our nature. You're not going to have a predictable weather anymore. That's what's being stated here. So it's not going to snow at a certain time. It's not going to rain at a certain time. It's not going to be hot at a certain time. We usually depend on these as intermediaries to the nature, and we get really annoyed if something goes wrong. So imagine just a rain like this causing a problem, but imagine something like Harvey or a Sandy hitting. What are we doing to be prepared? So we need to understand two things: how energy works and how water works. So as individuals, what are we doing today in terms of conserving the energy, but also how are we living to live without the energy when the time comes? Because when a hurricane hits, you're not going to have energy. You need to be prepared to be engaged with the nature. So we need to be prepared for that. And as has been pointed out, water comes from both directions, not just from the ocean, but from up above, the storm water as well as the ocean water. So we need to understand how water works when you're actually living on a coast. So we need to educate ourselves about these two things to be prepared.
I think it's very important to be engaged with nature, but as well to be engaged as citizens. That's something I think is key, how we collaborate to find this solution. And perhaps from the university point of view, it's more clear, or even from a government point of view, what are the programs? Sometimes we debate more about the private sector, how they are engaging with their communities and with citizens to co-create this solution. So can we talk a little bit about what are the programs, or what are you doing from the different sectors to engage with citizens to be part of this solution? You could discuss, or you don't need to follow our order.
Yeah. So that was one of the biggest things that we were wanting to tackle after the release of the Climate Ready Boston report, because if you've seen it, it's online, it's 400 pages, it's very technical, it's sort of scary. A lot of people don't really know what to do with it if you're coming across this information for the first time. So it was really important for us to find a way to synthesize and simplify some of the data, and also present the information in a more solutions-oriented, maybe more positive way, and figure out how we can engage more people in this content and find ways for other people to become familiar enough with the challenges and the opportunities and the work of the city and the state and other partners to be able to go and speak to this themselves in their own communities or groups in places where the city either doesn't have the capacity to reach, or doesn't have the access, or maybe isn't the best spokesperson in that community. So our attempt at addressing that challenge was a program that we launched this summer called the Climate Ready Boston Leaders. It's something that's online, but the point of it really was to create a resource set that people could use to better understand this report and its findings. We translated into the top 5 languages spoken in Boston, and we gave small grants to community members to come in, get a training on what the report's finding was, what the resources say, and then challenge them to go out and reach at least 30 people with this content, and that we would give them a small grant in order to do so. About 100 people applied to the program from all across the city. About 70 ended up coming to the training, and about half of those led events over the summer that reached close to 500 people. So that's a program that we're taking in the lessons that we learned from this first round and relaunching it again early next year, even bigger and better. But yes, this was a huge challenge of how to engage people in this topic, because it's something that for most people seems very far off, very in the future, and don't really understand how it relates to them or what they can do. And unlike cities like New York or New Orleans or other places that have had big storms in recent memory, there's just a lot more public awareness of the problem and of how it affects you and what to do. And then there's a lot more funding also coming in from the federal government to solve the problem and to fix to fix what happened. So here in Boston, we're very fortunate to not have had a big storm, obviously, but it also means that people aren't really thinking about climate change, and it's not really on the front of their mind. So it's an even harder challenge to go out and really present this information as something that we want people to engage in and to understand what it means for them and their families and their businesses and whatever they're doing here in Boston, but also how it relates to the other issues that they care about and they think about on a daily basis, whether that be transportation or housing or energy use or all the things that are so related.
Yeah, I think in the world of climate change, there's a lot of focus on getting the best science and getting the best data to really understand the problem and to develop solutions, and that is critically important. But I think we've really recognized as a state that the people are an equally important element of this. And so I think for us, we've focused very much on citizens and also on state agencies across state government, because for most of us, this is, for most staff, this is new, that they'll be working on this and planning for this into the future. So we sort of see two education streams, both for citizens and for staff. And I think I mentioned the work we're doing with 71 cities and towns this year to help them begin the planning process for climate change. One of the big drivers of the program design was not to give communities money, let them hire a consultant, have the consultant come in, complete a plan, and then leave. The idea when they applied for these grants was they're small grants. There has to be a significant willingness from the community to engage in this. The community is responsible for pulling together a core team and a team lead. And then we're actually training close to 300 state service providers who will go out and work collaboratively with the communities. And instead of creating a new plan, I think this is an important piece too, we'll show them how to incorporate climate change information into all of their planning frameworks across their city or town. So I think for us a big part of this has been bringing climate change sort of into the mainstream of what people do on a daily basis rather than having it as a new thing. It's a similar approach we're taking with state agencies, is showing them how to include climate change in their existing efforts, but very people-oriented.
I mean, our program actually works with a lot of industry, and so we're seeing a lot of interest in major corporations in the world, in the health industry, manufacturing, agriculture, energy. Are there systems vulnerable to climate change across the world? So I think it's important to begin to see some of that, because obviously they're the ones that are going to bring us vaccines, food, water, and energy. So it's good to see companies taking that up. I guess I'd like to ask my colleague here, who's in the architecture business. We're doing a lot of new development on the coast, or maybe our city folks as well, on the coast here. Are those companies that are building those buildings, are they coming to you and asking about how do we design these buildings for climate change?
Should we ask him?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna get to that and define the citizenship a little bit differently from what I see and how I do it. A good portion of the built environment is built by the private sector, and that's who we engage with. And what resonates with private sector, whether we like it or not, is the value creation, right? Unless there is a value in something, the investors are not going to invest. And clearly, over time, there is a recognition now that there is value in having buildings that are resilient. If you are living in this building, people are asking questions, what is my situation is going to be like if I'm living on the seaport, which is one of the most vulnerable districts in the city, which is one of our relatively newly planned, but yet highly vulnerable. If I'm working there, how long am I going to be out of work? Is my data center safe? Am I getting backup energy? And a whole host of questions that are being asked by the tenants and by the potential users. That is really bringing into focus in terms of what the private sector is trying to do. But outside of that, there is a tremendous recognition. We're fortunate enough to be in the Northeast, that there's a lot of enlightened self-interest in the development community. We're not talking about some other parts of the country where these issues are still very, very early. We're very advanced. So, and part of that is a good headway in terms of thinking about sustainability and energy already. which is almost 60% of the game. Now we're just thinking about the water. So there is a lot of focus on how at different scales you want to think about the building or a particular site, and how do you work with it during the specific disasters. And then the big operating hypothesis is that we're not going to stop the water. It's living with water. Water is going to come in. How much ever we model, we can't model for everything. There's going to be a leak somewhere. I always wonder, if there could be a model like the traffic model for water, we'll be all set. We have come after 30 years or 40 years, we can really predict to the last degree how many cars are going to be generated by a particular development. We can't quite do that with water, right? I mean, we could do a certain degree. So that level of precision is not going to happen. Water is going to come in. So what we are looking at is how do you actually stay while the water is here, stay safe, operate during the situation, like I said, energy, water, and food, for example, and then how quick is the recovery and what happens. So it has to do with how your building materials faring. The water staying in a building for 3 or 4 days has a profound impact on a building as opposed to rain just coming and going. So the way we think about the landscapes, the way we think about the ground force of the building and how they interact with the sidewalks is all changing quite dramatically, and the private sector is thinking very consciously about these things on a daily basis.
And the topic, I think, is fundamental, right? How to engage with citizens, and not only as we've seen in Mexico, for example, after the earthquake, how quick they were, not only at helping their own citizens, which is something that you would expect, solidarity and cooperation, but also they were creating apps and websites and different tools to channel the aid and communication and gather people. They did it even better than the government or many companies, so that's why I think it's very key. But all of these things are very expensive, right? And we always have the problem of funding these projects. And mainly when we think we have to put money in something that we will see the impact perhaps in 5, 10, or 20 years from now. So what are the best solutions or alternatives we can think about public-private partnerships or federal or local grants? How we help the communities to invest in programs and to be prepared for this? I don't know who wants to start.
Well, like I said, value creation is the best way, one of the best ways to do that, and you need to really create a certain type of value incentive. One is clearly tenants asking for it, right? The other is the zoning incentives, for example, that incentivize additional development, let's say, to offset from the private sector. But in a larger term, longer term infrastructure projects, there are great examples in Europe. There are development investment finance organizations that are specifically investing in resiliency for private sector to basically take on particular projects at a building scale or at a large scale to really invest in this, and there are special mechanisms figured out for the recovery of the investment, et cetera. But it is a multi-dimensional, multi-sectoral kind of an issue. I think that we're making good progress, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah, I think there's certainly an overwhelming need for new funding for some of these efforts, and a lot of sort of unique financing ways to think about how to build more money around different resiliency efforts. I think one of our focuses on the state side, and something we feel like is a first step on the question of spending, is making sure all of the existing spending we do as a state, which is quite a lot, starts to be tuned to climate change. So none of the spending that we currently do has that factored into it. So we might be spending on a road through a state grant that currently isn't prioritized in a climate change way. So one of the big efforts, and one of the reasons it's been great to work across state government on this issue, is to start to incorporate the science and data we have on what climate change is going to look like into how we make decisions on how we currently spend money. I think once we've conquered that, then the next step is how to get more money. But I think a good first step is making sure that all of the tax dollars that we are currently investing are not going to things that are maladaptive or would create dangerous situations in the future.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of, as infrastructure is rebuilt, planning ahead is the cheapest way. Retrofitting, going back, is expensive. So the MIT campus we're thinking of, rebuilding the campus, but thinking 50, 70 years ahead, and as we rebuild, make sure it's set up, because that can add 5-10% to the cost, but retrofitting could be 50% of the original cost. So that's really critical. It's also the better science we can have in predicting what we need to prepare for and when, the more we can kind of stage what we do through time, so that we're not adapting now to something that's going to happen in 100 years, but adapting to things now that are going to happen in 10, 20, 30 years, and then waiting until we really need to. So the more we think strategically about what we do, the more we can spend our money intelligently.
Yeah, I mean, I would second what Katie and the other panelists have been saying. One of the bigger challenges is making sure that the money that we're spending now, climate change projections are informing the planning and development that we already have slated, that's already in the pipeline, that's already coming. And looking forward into the future, how the new investments that we're going to have to make in flood protection and various other adaptations, how is that going to be funded in partnership with the private sector and the rest of the community that's going to be benefiting from them? Now in the projects that we're doing in East Boston and Charlestown and South Boston, these are the questions of the hour. First, it's a matter of figuring out what exactly we want to do and what is a solution that will be effective and will be effective over time and that will present multiple benefits for the neighborhood in addition to flood protection. And then once we have a clear idea of what the strategy actually is, then we're looking at exactly this question. What are the mechanisms to finance it from the government side in partnership with the private sector and in partnership with the community? How do we look at district improvement financing and other tools that currently exist as a mechanism to fund resilience? But this is very much what we're actively figuring out now.
I mean, in the end, some of the protective measures might be expensive, but the opposite, not protecting and having catastrophic damage, is even worse, right? So some of these things we just have to.
And some of the, I think to that point, some of the things we've been looking at, and to an earlier point about nature, is actually using some of these nature-based solutions that have co-benefits, that are cost-effective, but looking at valuing some of, what is a floodplain worth in dollars in terms of avoided flood risk? What are some of these natural infrastructure pieces? How can we better value them and capture that in terms of looking into the future and avoiding risk?
And perhaps making this investment more sustainable and not that expensive, we can connect better with entrepreneurs and startups that are actually working on solutions. And here at HubWeek, we have a lot of startup entrepreneurs, perhaps here in the audience as well. So tell us a little bit, what are the opportunities for those startups to think and contribute with solutions, and how they can help their communities as well, the communities where they live?
That's a tough one. If I had a good idea, I'd have a startup.
We don't have an entrepreneur here at the panel. Next time we should have an entrepreneur as well to ask, what are my opportunities?
I'm not sure this answers it directly, but we have noticed there's been a real interest from the consulting engineering community in getting engaged in our community grant program. We had just really high interest in getting certified to get to work with communities through this program. But I think something that is a good model for this is the clean energy development in Massachusetts. We've seen 75% job growth over the last 3 years, I think, alone in that space. And I think a lot of the things we'll need for resiliency on the building side with infrastructure are sort of in a similar, just ripe for new companies to develop solutions, to look for cost-effective ways to address this, and then there is a real planning and sort of data-heavy need as well.
Yeah,
there's such a huge creative challenge that we've been planning and developing our cities with the assumption that the environment is static and it's the same as it's always been. And now that assumption no longer exists, so there's full creativity needed in thinking about how we plan and develop in the future when conditions are constantly going to be changing and when the science is constantly going to be changing. And that is true both on the sort of resiliency, building and development type of side of things. It's true on the social resilience. How do communities, how are they prepared? How are they less vulnerable socially and economically to these impacts? And then, as Katie was saying, the other side of the coin, the clean energy and the energy efficiency and the mitigation side is as important as ever, because if the projections for climate change in Boston showed us anything, it's that if we're not able to reduce our carbon emissions significantly, and if we're not able to drastically reduce the amount of energy that we use in our buildings and in our transportation systems and across society, then the impacts in Boston are going to be tremendous. And they're going to, it's going to be very different than if you look at the scenario when we are able to reduce carbon emissions, and those sea levels and those rain and heat levels, they're a lot lower. But if you look at the business as usual pathway, it's a very significant. So it just goes to show the creativity and the entrepreneurship that is still very much needed on the energy mitigation side, in addition to the resilience side.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, like adding, looking at solutions that do both the mitigation, accomplish both goals, mitigation and adaptation. We're interested in things like, as we modernize our electric grid, how do we make sure we're also building in storage capacity and backup systems that make it a more resilient grid at the same time as we're making it a cleaner grid that's able to handle these distributed energy needs. We're looking at the transportation sector is the next thing on our agenda in terms of mitigation. And as we're looking at the transportation sector and reducing emissions from it, we also need to build a whole resilient transportation infrastructure system. So I think entrepreneurs, companies with new big ideas on this could really benefit from looking at some of these, two-pronged solutions.
I would like to open the questions to the audience, but before, just to give an idea and perhaps helping John as well, there's an incredible initiative that actually Kathleen leads at MIT that is a climate collab, and actually you can submit and participate with startup, with ideas and experts to find solutions to this problem of climate change. But now if we have some questions, if you want to say your name and the question with a question mark, so we can ask many questions in the audience. Thank you.
Sure, my name is Katie, and my question is, how much does the federal government agenda matter in all of this? We're talking about city issues, state issues. Does the federal agenda matter, and if so, how much?
The federal agenda. How the federal agenda impact in perhaps local and state agenda?
Well, the federal government certainly matters in this. I think we are doing a lot as a state in the absence of sort of federal movement on this currently. We're part of, Massachusetts is now part of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is a set of 14 states focused on meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement that the federal administration pulled out of. When that happened, these 14 states formed a coalition. We're all trying to make sure we meet those targets. And actually, as a coalition, we represent the third largest economy in the world. So pretty, active group. So we can do a lot to reduce emissions, to adapt to climate change as individual states, as cities. But there really is that need for federal leadership on this issue too. There's a need for federal funding when we start talking about infrastructure and resiliency. There are a lot of federal grant programs that address climate change. If those programs get cut, we have issues. I think we've been lucky in Massachusetts to have very strong support on this issue from our governor, right from the top, and then just to have a lot of different ways to address this and to work with our partner states on this topic. But I think one of the things that states are really important for right now is showing that leadership on this issue remains strong in the U.S. so that other countries who have agreed to the terms of the Paris Agreement don't get discouraged and pull out and think that our states are not working on this. So leadership's as important as anything else.
We have another question of the audience.
Hi there, my name is Julia. I was wondering if you'd speak a little bit both on the policy and planning sides about what we can learn from other cities around the country and around the world that are approaching this issue in innovative ways.
Yeah, great question. We've been learning a lot from New York because after Hurricane Sandy, they put in place a lot of new policy, and they're doing dozens and dozens of resilience projects all across their waterfront. And so we've been learning a lot from them on what levels of sea level rise they're planning for, how they're doing these waterfront flood protection infrastructure projects, how they're, they even have some of the buyout type programs in areas that are just too vulnerable to rebuild in. So there's definitely a lot that we're learning from. We're part of many national and international networks of cities that are constantly sharing information on what they're doing and how to do it better, and how we're learning from other places. And then here in this area, we're also part of a Metro Boston coalition of the 14 municipalities in the greater Boston area who also work together to address regional issues of climate preparedness, since though each municipality is focused on their own borders and their own needs, obviously the climate impacts are very easily and quickly regional. So we work together as that group with the municipalities and the state and many state agencies on those regional challenges in this area.
Well, there are a number of projects around the globe. In Europe, he's leading a lot of these HafenCity in Hamburg, which is a new area of the city that's built on the docklands, is built to allow the water to come in. I mean, clearly, the landscape plays a very significant role in creating soft infrastructure. That's another thing we're talking about. We're not talking about hard infrastructure. At some point, we'll have to deal with the harbor, what I would like to call is a threshold, not a barrier, connecting the harbor islands. And it's not meant to be this gigantic dam that is protecting the city, but it becomes a civic, environmental, ecological, social infrastructure that you can actually inhabit and engage, as opposed to something that is disconnecting you from the nature again. So there are a number of examples like that. And on the sustainability on the energy side, again, in order to reduce the emissions, you have to really think very carefully. One of the projects we're working on is the Masdar city in Abu Dhabi, which is started off as a carbon neutral city, not carbon neutral anymore because that's just mathematics, but really thinking about everything that you draw and build with purpose. This is something that we don't do. Everything that you draw, everything that you build has to have at least 3 or 4 meanings. It can't have one meaning. So at the moment you start thinking about it like that, you change the way you think about sustainability and resiliency. So think of everything that we do in our daily lives having multiple meanings, not just one, and multiple meanings when you're actually designing or building anything. Then you'll achieve a tremendous level of return and flexibility.
Do you have any other question from the audience? Perhaps to close this panel, yeah, here? Oh, sorry, I didn't see you.
It could be only 10 billion, which isn't that much. The big dig cost 24 billion total, right? So the sea barrier, this is a real thing. Could anybody comment who knows more about it? Because there's not that much written in the pop media.
Well, I mean, I think I haven't looked that much at the Boston one, but faculty at MIT were involved in developing the Venice sea barrier. There's also been a look at the London Thames River barrier. I mean, they're very controversial because just how you operate them and what they can do is an issue. You're trying to more prevent these storm surges from coming in, not obviously creating a permanent barrier. So this flexibility of them to kind of go up when you need them and down when you don't is a crucial element. But
yeah, I think the cost is something that nobody can predict with anything. It's a very hard thing to say. But one of the advantages that we have is the harbor islands that are already there for the most part, with certain missing links in between. If you go through any of the projections and you look at a map and slide over 2070, 2100, harbor islands still show up without being blue, which is they're already there. So it's about linking them in a careful, environmental friendly manner. One of the things we need to consider is also the environment. This just can't be a hard infrastructure. There are plant life, habitat, whole host of things that live in there that needs to be considered. But my sense is once you have a great vision, you can make it happen. And New York has the Big U, for example, which they're hacking away incrementally around the city from 42nd Street all around Lower Manhattan. So if there is a big vision and a champion, these things will happen over time. Money, of course, will follow, just like the Big Dig, hopefully.
So we are out of time, but I would love to give 15 or 20 seconds to each of our speakers to tell us some idea about, it seems that the future will be living with water. So how do you envision that future, and what is your role to fight against the impact of the negative impact of climate change?
Well, I just hope our program can continue. You talked about federal cuts. Our program is in part dependent on federal funding, and I think the science element of getting better prediction is where I put my life, and I hope we can.
More science.
I hope we can do better.
I think looking at ways to engage people better around living with nature, living with changing situations. Floodplains are going to be a big part of this, floodplains and coastlines. So continuing to look for solutions on that front, and then continuing to combat climate change is a really big part of this that we need to not forget.
Maya?
Yeah, for me it's identifying the types of solutions that are going to improve the city and improve communities in the city no matter what the flood impacts end up being, and that their benefits are not only going to be for flood protection or for climate change, but for improving the environmental quality, improving the health, improving the well-being of the city for all residents, and that we really take a deep community look as to what does it really mean to build resilience, and we focus on that as opposed to just the immediate risk of flood protection.
Kishore?
So building cities or buildings is no longer just architects designing. It is a lot more than that. So there is a need for convergence and collaboration across disciplines between private developers who are building the buildings, architects, engineers, scientists, finding ways to really get at the problems much more carefully, and being adaptable throughout the time, because we just can't predict what's happening tomorrow. That's one of the things that is certain, is the uncertainty. So being flexible, and one of the great things about cities, good cities are flexible, they're adaptable. I think Boston is an incredibly adaptable city. We're starting at a great foundation, so there's a lot of hope, but everything that we add needs to be equally adaptable and better.
Thank you very much, and please join me in a round of applause for these great speakers. Thank you.